All right, well, we're going to get started. Thanks for joining us. We are really excited to have Adam Minter with us today to kick off this Mining the Climate Crisis series, which was a series of conversations with global, local, and state experts about metal recycling and other opportunities available to Minnesota to expand our reuse of already mined metal. This webinar and podcast is fueled by MCEA supporters, and we really want to thank folks who are our supporters for that support. It allows us to do this really complex work on complex issues with global and local impact like metal supplies and the clean energy and EV revolution. So please consider a contribution to make even more of this work possible, and we'll put a link in the chat box if you're so inclined to make a donation. As I mentioned, this webinar is the first in a three-part series exploring the themes in our Mining the Climate Crisis series. And the next webinar will be in 2 weeks on December 13th, and will feature local experts on e-waste recycling and ways that Minnesota can increase our waste recycling rate. We're thrilled to have three guests: Maria Jensen, who is the Environment and Safety Liaison at Repowered, which is a local e-waste recycling company; Dr. Rupali Padkey from Macalester College; and State Representative Athena Hollins from St. Paul. And we're all going to be discussing Minnesota's metal recycling opportunities and challenges, as well as the upcoming legislative session. So that next webinar is in 2 weeks from December 13th, also at noon, from noon to 1 p.m. And you can register just like this one for free and learn more about the whole series at mncenter.org. And we'll put a link in the chat as well. All these webinars will be recorded as well, available to watch online at MCEA's YouTube page and on our website. And we'll also be turning these conversations into podcasts and sharing them in that format as well, if that's the kind of thing you like. So if you missed one of these conversations or want to share today's webinar with somebody else, we'll have opportunities to do that very soon, even later today. And you can watch and learn at your own pace. So what we have planned today is to have an in-depth conversation with Adam Minter about the state of metal recycling in the United States and worldwide. And this includes themes like metal recycling's history in Minnesota, the US, and globally, and how the industry has changed over the past few decades, how demand for metals driven by clean energy and EV demands is changing that market and metal recycling's role in meeting some of those demands, and what countries worldwide do best at recycling metals and what we can learn from them here in the United States and in Minnesota. And lastly, we'll answer your questions. We'll hold about 15 minutes for audience Q&A at the end of the conversation. And again, put your questions in the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. So first, quick introductions. My name is Aaron Clems. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer at the Minnesota Center for Environmental Advocacy, where I work on legislative and communications strategy for the organization. And I'm really pleased to be having a conversation today with Adam Minter. Adam is a Bloomberg journalist and commentator. He's the author of 2 books, Junkyard Planet and Secondhand: Travels in the New Global Garage Sale, which I have right here. You should go check it out if you haven't already seen it. And he's a well-regarded expert on his beat, which is the global scrap trade. And I'll just turn it over to Adam briefly to introduce himself.
Yeah, hi, thanks, Aaron, and thanks for MCEA for hosting this. It means a lot to me as a native Minnesotan to be able to talk to folks back home about this really critical issue. So thanks for making this happen. You know, I'm a native-born Minnesota. I grew up in the recycling trade, which is something I talk about in Junkyard Planet. My family actually were small-time Jewish scrap peddlers from Russia, dating back a century in this country, and I came up in that business. Elected not to go into it, went into journalism, but one thing you find with people who are interested in metal recycling is if they spend about 6 months in it, in my experience, they always circle back. And here I am all these years later writing about it instead of actually doing it. So glad to talk about it with you, Aaron.
Yeah, I mean, I know that you have this deep background as, someone whose family has deep roots in the recycling and scrap business. I'm wondering, how he got into this as a journalist. Yeah. I know that's how you got back, but I wonder if you talk a little bit more about how you circled back.
Yeah. So, I mean, I was in my early 20s and I was actually working a bit in the family business, and I found out that I really didn't have much of a talent for the family business. And I had always had the itch to write. And it was my thought that, I was going to go to the New Yorker and cover presidential campaigns or something like that. But the New Yorker was not having me to write about presidential campaigns. And so the advice that I was given, and every writer is given, is write what you know. And so I started pitching a scrap metal trade magazine out in Washington, D.C. called Scrap, and started doing articles for them because what I knew was recycling. And in the early 2000s, it was the time when we were starting to hear about lots of U.S. scrap being imported by China. And there was a lot of mystery about what was going on with that. And Scrap and the editor there, Kent Kaiser, was very interested in having somebody go over and get a look at these recycling operations. And at the time, I really had nothing to lose. Wasn't married, didn't have kids, didn't have a mortgage, didn't have anything. So sort of raised my hand and said, I'll do it. Kent said, you're crazy. It was crazy, actually. I didn't speak Chinese for one thing, and but I went over and, on what I thought would be a month or two thing, and it ended up being 12 years in China, where I was for most of that time the only person covering the Trans-Pacific trade in recycling, and that became lots of reports, writing for the Wall Street Journal, the Atlantic. And ultimately, some of that reporting ended up in my first book, Junkyard Planet.
Yeah. So, I mean, having that kind of firsthand exposure, and you're right. I mean, this is kind of an area that's shrouded in mystery for a lot of people, especially
Sure.
a lot of Americans. I wonder if you just talk a little bit briefly about recycling's, how it is a significant part of the global trade in metals, and how significant it is, and whether or not what's changing recently. Obviously, there's been a lot of adjustments over the last just couple of years of the COVID pandemic.
Right. Well, I think to start with, and we could have had this conversation 20 years ago, and I'd start with the same thing, which is that recycling is absolutely essential to the manufacture of stuff globally. And by stuff, I mean everything from your laptop to your car. So let's just start with North America. Roughly 50% of the steel used in North America, United States, Canada, and Mexico, comes from recycled resources. You get rid of that and you've got a shortage of steel. Globally, around 1/3 of the copper inputs come from recycled resources. You get, there's debate over aluminum, but you could say roughly half of the inputs globally for aluminum production come from recycled inputs. And that's everything from aluminum cans to automobile engine blocks. I've been in factories in Ohio where they're melting down scrap and taking it in melted form to automobile facilities in the south of the United States to make into automobile blocks. So if you eliminate that, whether it's in North America or within China, which is, sort of the world's manufacturing colossus right now, you basically seize up global supply chains. So recycling, even though we tend to think of it as this environmental imperative in the US, and we do it, first of all, many of us do, put that stuff in our bin because it's good for the environment. We could talk about what that means. For people who are in manufacturing, people who are in the recycling industry, it's absolutely essential to our economies, our ways of life, and our jobs. It's as important for some metals as mining.
Yeah. So America's role in the global scrap and recycling economy is really complex, in part because we are such a huge consumer of a lot of this stuff, whether it's electronics, laptops, et cetera. And yet Americans are largely unaware of what happens with their electronic waste and other metal scrap comes to the end of its useful life, and then enters this reuse, recycling economy. You said a moment ago, like, we think of this as an environmental imperative, not so much a business. What do you wish Americans better understood about the recycling economy and what role it plays in creating the stuff that we consume?
So when I was first in China, first year or two, I first heard the term Saudi Arabia of scrap. And it's a great term because just as Saudi Arabia is sort of the world's great source of oil, Chinese scrap traders viewed America due to the large amount of waste that occurs here. I mean, we throw away a lot of stuff, as this great source for recycled materials to be used in manufacturing in China. And the thing, and I would like Americans to appreciate that term, but more than that, I'd like them to appreciate sort of the verbs that go around this trade. I've found over the years that Americans tend to think of recycling, especially if it goes overseas, but even if it stays within North America, as recycling that's sent somewhere. We send our recycling overseas. I'm sure many people have heard that term and use it themselves. In my experience, that's an inaccurate description of how the global recycling trade works, because it's a market-based trade. Scrap is not sent, it's imported, it's purchased. There's a market for it. And if there is no market for it, it's garbage and no one's going to import it. Then it's going to be exported into a landfill. And I think that's a really tough leap for people to make, that verb, because it's become so ingrained, especially in sort of North American and European discourse. There's this waste colonialism narrative that we're dumping. That's another verb that gets used. But the fact of the matter is, in China, in West Africa, where I've spent a lot of time reporting on this trade, nothing is sent there. Every single container of scrap is purchased. There's a purchase order for it. And you can go to the ports and you can oftentimes see these bills of lading if you want to. And that gets to the most important aspect of this, which is that this is a manufacturing input. And if you're going to have more recycling, you have to appreciate that people want it to make new stuff. And as I said earlier, if somebody doesn't want to make something from it, if somebody doesn't want to buy it like an ore that you would dig out of the ground somewhere, then it's garbage. It's nothing. And so for me, it's that market-based imperative that I think people really have to understand, or they're misunderstanding how this all works.
Yeah. I mean, and we've seen huge shifts in the global recycling economy, and particularly China's role in it. I know your Junkyard Planet book, which I thought was really helpful for me understanding like the global economy of recycling, it came out in 2013, and things have changed a lot in the last 10 years. And I'm wondering if you were thinking about updating that book for 2023 and beyond, where would you start? How have things changed in the last decade?
I've thought about that question a lot over the last 5 years. I think, a lot of the folks who are on this call are aware of some of the restrictions that China imposed on recycling. They announced them in 2018, and they really started squeezing in 2019 on the imports of recyclables into China. They restricted a lot of them, and it disrupted the global recycling trade for American recycling companies that had become accustomed over 25 years of exports to exporting to China, because China was this great manufacturing behemoth that needed these raw materials. All of a sudden they were bereft, and you saw all these stories about, there's stuff piling up, there's nowhere to recycle anymore. Where I would start the book is really right around 2020, and a number of my contacts in China who are recyclers suddenly had to shut down their businesses because they didn't have raw materials for their recycling operations anymore. And again, it gets back to this idea that, even though we tend to think of it as an environmental imperative here, if you go to these places that import it, and that doesn't have to be China. I mean, Indiana imports scrap metal from Minnesota. But if you suddenly cut off their access to it, you have manufacturers who are struggling. A story I tell about recycling in China, this actually has to do with paper, because China was a major importer of scrap paper from the US. After the restrictions were imposed, you had cardboard factories that supply to people like Nike in real trouble because they couldn't import US cardboard. They couldn't get enough of it. US used cardboard is a very, very high quality, much higher quality than the used cardboard that's available in China, which is recycled over and over. And the more you recycle something, a piece of cardboard, the fibers get shorter and the quality goes down. So all of a sudden they can't get this US cardboard. So what did they do? They were restricted from importing recycled cardboard. They started importing and buying new cardboard because their mills wouldn't work otherwise. And that just gets to the heart of the matter. These are raw materials, and if you cut them off, you're going to put manufacturers in a tough spot.
Yeah. No, I mean, and so, I mean, we're really particularly interested in this conversation about metals, and I know that the paper and plastic stuff, I mean, I'd love to talk a little more about plastics in a minute.
Yeah.
But as far as metals as commodities go in terms of the recycling economy, there's no free lunch. I mean, ultimately, like there is environmental impact, whether we're talking about mining or recycling. All the ways in which metals enter our commodities markets come at some cost to the environment and create pollution in some fashion. So I guess my question, and you've got some pretty good, interesting narrative in your first book about this. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what Minnesotans should know about the environmental impact of recycling and how it compares with other ways to get the same inputs for example, copper, nickel, and
Sure. Well, I mean, the term that's very much in vogue right now is closed loop, and the sustainability of closed loop. And this may come off as controversial, but no closed loop system is sustainable in the sense that it requires energy inputs. It will expend energy. There will be emissions. Recycling requires energy inputs, and very little metal recycling can be accomplished without putting new ores into the metal to keep up purity levels. We all see, is it three arrows, the triangular three arrows. I've always been irritated by that symbol because I think it's inaccurate, because there should be a couple more arrows. There should be sort of the arrow that has stuff leaving and the arrow going in. Now, those are smaller arrows, but they're still there. I mean, it's thermodynamics. I mean, everything falls apart. You just can't have a perpetual motion machine, and that goes for recycling as well. So that's a general observation on it. Getting more specific, recycling is a manufacturing process. It just is. And if you're making metal, whether that metal's being made in a new plant up on the Iron Range, where you're taking, taconite and making it into, pig iron or whatever else they're making up there these days, or if you're melting down steel in a mini mill, somewhere in Iowa, both of those are going to be manufacturing processes that require enormous amounts of energy. That's the bad news, I guess you could say. The good news is that on balance, you're going to use less energy, fewer raw materials in a recycling process than you are in a virgin process. But that doesn't mean you can separate them out. I mean, what it means is you want to maximize those recycling processes, but you're still going to need those new inputs. I'm always, as a journalist and as somebody who's been part of this industry for as long as I can remember, I get a little annoyed when you see people put recycling off to the side and say, look how terrible these recycling processes are. And don't get me wrong. I spent 12 years in China. I've been all over the world looking at recycling. I have seen the absolute worst that this industry has to offer. What is it? Rutger Hauer says in Blade Runner, I've seen things you people wouldn't believe. I have. But I will say, in general, the worst recycling processes I've seen on balance are much better than what you will see with some of the standard mining practices that occur in places like Indonesia and other parts of the emerging markets which are supplying the bulk of the ores that are going into plants in places like China. So I think you have to be sort of, this is probably an obnoxious way to put it, but an adult about these things and be willing to say, something is not perfect, but it's better than others. One thing I often tell people is, we all want recycling to be this black and white issue, or black and green issue, I guess would be a better way to put it. Like anything else that's manufacturing oriented, it really is in that gray zone. It's a question of where you want it, along that continuum from black to green. And those are the kinds of conversations policymakers have to have.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think, we're having now this conversation is kind of on hyperdrive because we have all of this, money that's headed toward, the United States, the Inflation Reduction Act, is $300+ billion dollars being directed toward really like jumpstarting the electric vehicle revolution, the transition to solar and wind electricity. How are people in the recycling trade talking about or thinking about this new American demand, and what is that going to mean for the market in the coming years?
Well, it's going to mean big changes. I mean, just from a business standpoint, car recycling, automobile recycling in the United States is the largest source of used steel in the U.S. Cars are changing. The way it works now is you take out the most valuable parts and you put it in a shredder, and out comes stuff that you separate with magnets and other technologies. You don't want to do that with an EV. First of all, because the largest component of an EV is the battery. And so all of a sudden we're going from shredding things to saying, what do we do with these batteries? And battery recycling is a very, very new industry. There aren't very many of them. And there's lots of debates around how this should be managed, because there's sort of two problems here. Well, there's one big problem. When a car dies, you shred it. I mean, you recycle it, you shred it. Maybe it goes overseas to be shredded after use there. Right now, the way a lot of the car manufacturers are talking about their batteries, they say after the battery is depleted to 80%, it's just like your iPhone. At 80%, the iPhone doesn't work as well. We want that to go into the recycling chain. But the fact of the matter is, you can still run that car on 80%. And so there's a lot of fear about the secondary market and battery manufacturers losing control of these batteries because they're the most valuable part of the car. So who's going to be able to control this? Who gets the right to manage the battery? And is it really a good thing to be recycling these batteries at 80%? What if there's somebody, say, in Ghana, who's perfectly willing to take that 80% battery and run it down to 40%? Maybe they don't get 300 miles per charge on it. Maybe they only get 100 miles per charge, but they're perfectly happy driving that around a crop. So who's going to get that? So these are some very important economic and, I'd argue, moral considerations around reuse and recycling. Reuse was always, we've always had a secondhand car market, but the secondhand battery market is going to complicate things, and it's still shaking out. So it's very, very complicated. So that's a big deal. The other side of it is that we do have battery recycling infrastructure going in the US. A lot of this is really happening because of Tesla. No Tesla, no EV industry in the US by and large. And so Tesla has been ahead of everybody on this. Former Tesla executives are in charge of Redwood. They started Redwood, which is a major battery recycling operation. It's very small scale. And right now, the amount of batteries going in is quite small. And it's going to be that way for a long time because you're going to have reuse. So from a recycling standpoint, there just isn't enough out there to recycle into the needs that the EV industry is going to have.
Yeah, I mean, and add a little bit onto that. I mean, there's also lots of people talking about reusing EV batteries for other purposes after their end of life, right? So it might be useful, for example, for like a home to try to store some energy, and then you're basically your Tesla Powerwall approach, but doing it with a used EV battery instead, as opposed to a new one.
And that becomes problematic. I mean, I think for me, I love reuse, and I'm a believer, like, you reuse things until you can't, because that's the best way to reduce pressure on raw materials. But where it gets complicated from a policy standpoint is what happens when these batteries start leaving the US and you've subsidized, the US government or state governments, whatever, have subsidized the development of battery recycling infrastructure. But if you make the argument that the better use environmentally is for that battery to become a Powerwall or to be reused as a car battery in Ghana, or for that matter, in China, do we let it leave for that higher environmental use, or do we keep it here to recycle it in sort of these state subsidized battery recycling operations? And these are conversations that are starting to happen with the industry. They're not quite happening, so far as I know, on the policymaking level yet, but they're the kinds of conversations we're going to have. And so, and questions about whether these critical resources, if we want them used to their utmost environmental benefit, whether they should be leaving the US for recycling elsewhere.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, and you raise another interesting issue, which is that, there's all these questions of policy that underlie how we manage this trade, how we maximize reuse and recycling. And so much of the American discourse around recycling is on a very individual consumer basis about what you do, as opposed to thinking about it as a structural or industry-wide or policy problem to solve. And so for this industry, like all other industries, government policy matters a lot. I mean, what are some of the countries across the globe that are doing a really good job of capturing metals and other e-waste for recycling? And what can Minnesotans and Americans learn from those countries as we think about policy development around this area? Because it feels really underdeveloped, quite honestly. Like Minnesota's e-waste recycling law, which is not terrible, but it was passed in 2007. And a lot of things have changed since then. And I'm just wondering if you've got some ideas about places to go look for better examples of policy worldwide.
And so I would tell you to, this may surprise some folks listening, but I would say go and look at China and Asia. And I point back to China because it wasn't always a formal decision to do it this way, but largely policymakers in China said, look, we're resource poor, natural resource poor, raw material poor, but we want manufacturing. So one of the things they did is, in the late 70s and early 80s and really in the mid 80s, they basically opened their doors to import recyclables. And it was an industrial policy. They said, look, we are going to allow imports of recyclables. We are going to allow the development of recycling districts in Guangzhou, in Guangdong province, which became the factory to the world, the manufacturing hub of the world. And we're going to encourage manufacturers to co-locate in those areas. And oftentimes the recyclers did the same thing. It was industrial policy. It wasn't always that formal, but that's ultimately what happened. And it made a huge impression upon me then, and it continues to make an impression upon me now, this idea that if you want to see greater resource efficiency from a sustainability perspective, that is more recycling, you do need to have your recyclers and your manufacturing co-located. And I think as, states and also as the federal government starts looking at critical materials, because that's really the underlying issue in Biden's mining policy, you really need to be thinking in terms of manufacturers and recyclers working together, maybe not forcing them to, but being at least in close proximity. I mean, it's one of the reasons why we see, Tesla so interested in, domestic battery recycling. They want to recapture those materials, and it allows them to manufacture more. So for me, as a best practice, informally, they've done it there. Increasingly, we're seeing more formal attempts to do that. Japan has long, Japanese industrial policy has a very long history, and they've been very good over the years about working with their recyclers and their waste management companies and the utility companies, which come into this when you're dealing with copper and aluminum recycling, because there's huge power demands, putting them together again with manufacturers. And it's a way to ensure that you shorten the supply chain, you shorten the energy supply chain to get this stuff from one place to another. And increasingly, we're seeing it in Europe. So, I mean, that's a very general prescription, but I think it's an important prescription, because I think, we still tend to think in the US as recycling as something separate, and we recycle, and that's it. There's some movement. I was just in Phoenix a month ago talking to some folks with the city of Phoenix there, and they're starting to think along these lines. They want to be expanding certain types of recycling within the city, and they are now, I don't want to overstate this, but they are now thinking about, what will it take to get a manufacturer interested in being, somebody who buys that material. And I think that's the right way to go.
Well, I mean, and it's a really interesting point, because so much of the industrial policy over the last couple of years under the Biden administration has been about reshoring or onshoring some manufacturing that has been offshored over the past 20, 30 years. And that includes things like the Chips and Science Act, to try to increase the amount of semiconductors that are being manufactured here, which is also, that relies a lot on precious and other metals to do. And so it sounds to me like what you're saying is that, like, this question of recycling is not something you can confront separate from manufacturing, but it all becomes part of the same. And the goal is to get everyone co-located so that you're talking across the different materials inputs, as well as being close to the manufacturer that wants to use them.
Right. And, and one of the advantages of this is, look, reshoring is hard. And Bloomberg, we write a lot about it. And you are not going to bring the totality of the U.S. manufacturing economy as it existed in 1965 back to the United States. And I'd argue is a whole different conversation that you probably wouldn't want to anyway. But you can still bring some of it back, and there's environmental benefits to doing so. One of the things, I used to go to these Chinese scrapyards, and I'd say to myself, why aren't we doing this in the US? Some of the things they were doing. As a kid, I saw some of that happening, when I grew up. Let me give an example of just taking cables, power cables. They contain various kinds of metal. Copper is the one that's obvious. And the way you often recycle cables is you need to strip the insulation off them. And you can do, there's automated ways of doing that, but some cables you just need somebody to stand there with a stripping machine and do it. And I'd see whole cables without them being stripped, shipped to China. And sometimes the way that stuff was done in China was neither safe for humans or safe for the environment. And I knew it could be done better, but China wanted that stuff so badly, and they were paying such a premium for it. The U.S. recycler said, to heck with it, we'll send it over. That stuff is starting to happen again in the U.S., in part because China won't take it, and there just isn't another manufacturing power that will. So it'll get stripped, and that clean metal may still get, because you can still export recyclable metal to China, but it's now clean. So a lot of the risk that was involved in recycling it, maybe that insulation was being burnt, instead of being stripped, whatever it is, you aren't exporting that environmental and human safety risk. It's being done here, and China's buying that metal directly for a much safer process. So that's an advantage too. You're seeing the supply chains get stretched out that way, but they're becoming better supply chains.
Okay. So far you've described this recycling process as being really labor intensive. Right, which of course, in a high labor cost environment like we have in the United States, especially right now with such a tight labor market, it could be really challenging. I mean, I've read some stuff about some European e-waste recycling operations that are much more automated. I mean, what is the status of like how labor intensive? And of course, it's a continuum. I know that
Right.
part of the reason why you saw some of the e-waste shipped to Africa, for example, is because of that labor question and how cheap labor could be exploited, quite honestly, in that equation. But I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the
Yeah.
kind of continuum of labor and automation when it comes to this this business.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, like any business, as labor rates go up, the business becomes more automated. And that is something that I observed in China. I mean, it's far less labor intensive now than it was. You're seeing more automation of recycling process. And you're seeing that in terms of e-waste in the US and Europe. There has been very technically advanced e-waste processing in Japan and in Belgium for years. And a lot of the printed circuit boards, PCBs, they're called in the industry, were shipped to Japan, northern Japan, and to Belgium for years. We're starting to see those kinds of plants go in to the US. There's a company called Arubis, which I believe, if they haven't started the plant already, are building a $350 million, don't quote me on that, but $350 million plant in Georgia for basically the refining of mixed metals. It's an electrochemical process. I'm sure they've got other things going on. But what that means is you're not going to need to have somebody sit on the scrapyard floor, which I did as a child, and sort your aluminums from your coppers from your brasses. You can, and strip off the insulated wire. You can sort of throw it all. I'm being very general here. So again, but throw it all into the plant and out comes clean metals. Now there's an energy cost to that. There's a chemical cost to that. But it suddenly makes possible not the recycling of different kinds of mixed metals that you would used to be sorting in an economically efficient way. And that means more recycling and more materials from metals. And that's starting to happen everywhere. Just the technology has reached a point where this can be done now. So it's really encouraging. I mean, again, what are the costs of doing it? All I have to say is electrochemical, and I know certain people their backs will get up, and I get that. I'm not poo-pooing that at all, but it's there.
Yeah, I mean, and there's another proposal that I don't know that much about, but I'm wondering if you have any insight into it. Like, there's a company named Nth Cycle, for example, that is going to propose to use what they call electro extraction to recycle nickel, which actually kind of resembles in some ways the flotation processes and other kinds of processing you might see in a mining operation. And I'm wondering if, like, beyond that, like, what emerging technologies should we be on the lookout of the next few years that you're seeing in the industry that are coming to play, especially in high labor cost environments like we have in the United States?
Well, I mean, I think one of the things, and it goes together, is plastics recycling. And I know we're talking about metal today, but metal and plastics, I mean, they sort of go together increasingly, especially with EVs, where you have greater and greater plastic content with EVs. And again, it's a controversial subject, chemical recycling, advanced recycling. Different people have different terminologies for it, but this is a kind of recycling of plastics that can handle some of the plastics that are currently, we have trouble handling dirt using traditional mechanical recycling processes. So that's coming on, and that should help people, manufacturers, recyclers who are dealing with EVs. So I think chemical recycling, it's especially controversial in the US, but even if it never happens in the US, it's going to happen in Asia. I mean, and I think people need to keep perspective there. I mean, we may have a regulatory crackdown on these processes here, but all that's going to do is basically encourage the export of materials that can't be recycled in the U.S. to markets where they can be, which is kind of what happened in the 70s and 80s in the U.S. with a lot of metal recycling. So I think that's a very important development. What Nth Recycling is doing is really important to the battery recycling chain. So there's two different kinds of nickel. We're going to get a little granular here. I hope you don't mind.
No, please do.
Yeah, there's called class 1 nickel and class 2 nickel. Class 1 nickel is I believe it's 99.8% pure nickel. And that's about half the nickel deposits in the world. But it's a tricky material because it's often contained in sulfide ores. I'm sure alarm bells are going off right now with folks who've worked in the boundary waters. But you need class 1 nickel, that level of purity, to make the lithium batteries that we're accustomed to seeing going into cars right now. in theory, anthracycline's chemical process can take class 2 nickel, which is not nice to, no mining is perfect by any stretch, but it takes different kinds of ores, laterite ores, which are class 2, and can bring them up to that class 1 level. There's a lot of debate and a lot of skepticism about whether it certainly works, but whether the scale can be there to obviate the need for class 1. But it's certainly a technology that's out there that people are thinking about.
Yeah, I mean, and it's interesting too, because we've seen such real dynamism in the battery formulation questions around the EV industry. I mean, I think that if you told someone 3 years ago that, big swaths of the EV battery manufacturing industry would be moving away from cobalt and nickel and toward other formulations, people would have told you were a liar, and there was no way to do it without cobalt. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the changes we're seeing in the EV battery industry and what impact it might have on the recycling economy moving forward.
Well, one thing I've learned about raw materials and metals for the years is, don't project, further out than a year on where things are going. Let me step back. In the mid 2000s, copper reached record prices. I mean, they'd never been seen before. And what happened was something called demand destruction. Suddenly, you had manufacturers saying, we cannot afford to be using copper in our various devices anymore. We're going to have to find alternatives to copper and substitute. There's demand destruction. And so you had substitution, other metals, other efficiencies built into devices simply because it was just too expensive to do. There's a lot of concern amongst manufacturers, and you can see it with Tesla is a great example. A lot of concern over the price of nickel and the availability of nickel. Price and availability obviously go hand in hand, and so you see Tesla in particular shifting to these lithium ferrophosphate batteries, LFPs, when everybody thought they were going to be committed to the lithium nickel batteries forever. In China, that's the fastest growing segment of the battery market. Off the top of my head, I can't remember what percent of it is, but it basically goes into Tesla's lower priced. They go into the LFPs go into their lower priced cars. Why? They're great. LFPs are great, smaller environmental impact, but amongst other advantages. But they have two problems. One, they don't function as well in cold environments, so Minnesotans don't get your hopes up too high. And two, the energy density just isn't as good as lithium, which means that they're not going to go as far on the charge. But it's an alternative there, and if prices get out of control, people are going to opt for that. So there is a lot of dynamism, and I'm always hopeful. For innovation. And, I'm also realistic. I mean, you can only innovate yourself so far. Ultimately, you are going to need raw materials of some kind. You're going to need to make these things out of something, but hopefully you can make them as, out of something with less impact.
Yeah. I mean, and I think, this is one of those things that's frustrating for me as an advocate and someone who's been following this for a while, is that so much of the discourse around recycling is about consumer level understandings of what happens when I buy a thing and what happens when I'm done with the thing. And then the rest of it's a mystery, right? And then there's all this other stuff that underlies that in terms of industrial policy and, for that matter, decisions being made on an economically rational basis. I mean, what you just described, this is like macroeconomics 101, right? I mean, eventually, if you get too much expense for one input, you go searching for another one that can substitute for it. I guess, to come back to this question of consumer stuff, I mean, I think one of the cool things about your second book, especially, is this kind of demystification and kind of shining a light on what happens with goods when they leave our understanding of their first use, right? And understanding what a more circular economy looks like. So right now I'm looking at the back and I'm seeing the Goodwill mothership. We have one of the biggest sorting facilities the Goodwill has in the state. I'm wondering, what can Minnesotans do to encourage, not only thinking about less wasteful practices as individuals, but what are our policymakers what should our policymakers be thinking about in terms of developing this circular economy, encouraging reuse, especially when it comes to metals?
Well, I think, just to reference the second book, one of the towards the end of the book, I gave a few general prescriptions. And one of the prescriptions I give is, I'm a big supporter of right to repair laws. And right to repair is a very simple concept. It just means that, the consumer should have the right to repair their stuff. And more to the point, it means that manufacturers are going to have to make parts and knowledge available to independent repair shops so that they can repair things as well. ultimately, I think, the solution to all of this resource pressure we have is to use stuff as long as possible. I mean, if you look at what Apple itself says about the iPhone, more than 90% of the carbon emissions associated with it come during the production phase. So if you can produce less iPhones, one way to do that is to consume yours for longer. Well, how do you consume yours for longer? Make repair easier. The manufacturers are not thrilled at this idea. At least right now, they don't like being told that they have to sell parts to the average repair shop down the street. But the pressure is on. We're getting very close to passing right to repair in a number of states. And I think it goes beyond just, being able to put the battery into your device. I mean, ultimately, I think it's paving the way for different modes of ownership or leasing. And, I've written about this elsewhere, not in a book, but at Bloomberg is, there's one of the fastest growing segments of electronics now is electronics leasing. And there's been rumors for a long time that Apple, just to keep talking about Apple, is looking at it. And if Apple starts leasing devices to people, say for a year, there's a built-in incentive for Apple to make the devices more repairable because they're going to want to rent them to somebody else. And so anything that policymakers can do to encourage right to repair and these different forms of ownership that incentivize more repairable devices, I think is really a positive. So I would say that. And again, thinking more in terms of industrial policies and co-locating manufacturing, or at least incentivizing co-location of manufacturers and recyclers can make a huge difference.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think it's interesting. In Minnesota, right to repair has been around the legislature for a couple of years now. And one of the things that's the most potent arguments for it has been folks who are farmers who want to fix their combine, who want to fix their tractor, and they can't because so much of, I remember, as a kid growing up in the 70s and 80s, things like changing your own oil was a thing, right?
Yeah.
Or doing your own car maintenance. But when so much of it is software and it's less of it about actually being, and EVs now, I can open my thing and have no idea what to do, how to fix it. Right. So, I think part of it is to kind of a consumer shift away from the expectation that part of your job as a consumer is to continue to keep your thing that you bought in operating form. Yeah. And so much more of it has been replaced by a more disposable culture of buy a new thing when this one stops working.
And one thing I do like to add whenever I talk about this is, people tend to, and I understand it, there tends to be this belief that, oh, well, if we are buying less stuff, it's a hit to the economy. Now, there's studies out there that I know of that say repair versus manufacturing, but repair is a growing part of the economy, and it's been a part of the economy for a very long time. And I don't think, as we look at enabling repair through right to repair and lengthening the lifespans of our stuff, and it's not just phones and cars. It's everything. There are growth opportunities there as well. Yep.
So we've got about 15 minutes left, and I do want to turn to some of these audience questions. We already have 30 people who've already put in some things. There's some great questions in here. We're not going to get to every single one, but I'll do my best to get to some of the top line questions here. And one that going to start us off, I think, is kind of one of the questions that underlies a lot of the series that we've been writing about in the Mining the Climate Crisis series, which is, can recycling alone meet our country's demand for strategic and EV metals, including nickel? And I've got a thought about this, but I want to hear what you have to think about it first.
No. The short answer is no. Right now, let me just give you some data points, and I've looked into this a lot. So right now, about 70% of the nickel that's used in the world right now goes into stainless steel, and about 5% goes into batteries, and then there's 25% for catalysts and other things. The projection is, and the conservative projection is that we could be looking by the end of this decade that 35% of the world's nickel is going to go into batteries. Now, that's not going to happen. Certainly there may be some demand destruction with stainless steel manufacturing, but it won't be much. So that means you're going to need some additional sources to at least get the recycling, the loop going, if you will. There's just not enough out there. I think we tend to think of recycling and stainless steel in terms of developed countries. In the US, stainless steel demand is pretty flat. But if you go to emerging markets, if you go to China, if you go to Malaysia, if you go to Kenya, stainless steel demand is growing exponentially, because as people get a little bit of money in their pockets, what do? They buy washing machines, they buy appliances that require stainless steel. And so that demand's going to keep going up. So you're going to have to, as a global economy, who I don't know who I'm talking to, but a global economy is going to need sources of raw materials to meet this demand. At some point in the future, will we have an equilibrium where we can reduce the amount of demand for the mine materials? Maybe, I don't know. That would be very far out in the future. But at this point, if we're going to have an EV industry, if we're just talking about nickel, that's dependent upon batteries made with nickel, there's going to need to be new sources.
Yeah, I mean, I want to just flag two things. One is, I think the earlier conversation about material substitution and what happens when things get out of hand and are too expensive. So thinking about projections of material demand, it's always fraught with that problem.
Absolutely.
The second thing I just want to add is, I don't think anyone thinks that recycling is like a binary yes, no, this is going to replace mining or not. I mean, I think that to me is the wrong question. The real question is, what kind of choices do we have to make on an individual basis as a state? And I think one of those choices is which poison do we want to pick? To what extent, where do we want to put our emphasis and our values and our resources about increasing materials demand and increase materials availability? And I think one of the things that we're hopeful for is increasing the amount of captured materials, because quite honestly, we're landfilling a lot of metals right now, and that's a waste. And I think it's also fair to say that even if you acknowledge that mining is a necessary evil, I think in order to provide the materials necessary for consumer demand and other kinds of demands, that doesn't mean you have to build a mine everywhere someone proposes it either. And I think that's another question that I think we lose sight of when we pose it as a binary of just recycling versus mining. It's more about how can we make the smartest possible choices to get the materials that we need, and that it's going to include both.
Right, and I always think of it as just what price are we willing to pay for these closed loops? Because there is going to be an environmental price to every closed loop. We are going to develop closed loops, but what prices are we willing to pay? And I think we need to have those discussions. I mean, there's different trade-offs. There's carbon emissions. I'm very concerned. I mean, just in my writing and lately what I've been working on at Bloomberg, I'm talking a lot about climate adaptation and carbon. These things, you can't just push them all to the side. You're balancing out these different imperatives.
Yeah. One question that's in the chat, and I think you mentioned this earlier, I really want to come back to it, is about this question of metal recycling and plastics and how they're kind of connected with each other. In particular, there's been a lot of recent coverage, and I think you've written about this in Bloomberg as well, about this idea that plastics don't get recycled, and this Greenpeace report that kind of spurred that conversation.
Right.
I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what's been happening recently around plastics recycling, and whether we have any lessons that we can learn from plastics as we think about metals.
Yeah, well, I think what's exciting about plastics recycling, that in itself is a controversial statement, I guess, but I think what's exciting about plastics recycling now is just focusing on plastics, is there's huge demand from consumer brands companies for recycled plastic. So the companies that are making, your plastic Coke bottle or your HDPE detergent bottle, Procter & Gamble, General Mills, they are demanding more recycled content. And there actually is not enough recycled content out there. Why? Because there isn't enough collection of recycled, and there aren't enough plastics recycling operations out there. So that's exciting, because why is Procter & Gamble doing that? It's because consumers are demanding more sustainable materials in their packaging. But we have not built, as a state, or more to the point as a country, the infrastructure to collect these items. And I think that's really an important point that goes back to metals recycling. One thing that we're not good at in the US, North America in general, Europe, Japan, wealthy societies, affluent societies, is collecting stuff for recycling. We talk all this about, the technology of recycling, but you still need to collect it. And the most expensive part of any recycling process is actually going out and getting it. Developing countries are much better. Why? Because there isn't a lot of affluence there. And so if nobody's just going to forget an old iPhone in their desk drawer. They're going to go and sell it. And so, that's really key, I think, to building out these recycling economies. And we can focus all we want on the technology, but ultimately, I collecting it and creating a supply chain so that manufacturers can use this stuff. If it can't be collected, it's not a raw material that they're going to want a dedicated supply chain. So yeah, and I think that's something to be learned from plastics right now.
Cool. There's several questions in the chat about solar panel recycling and solar panel end of life, like reclaiming materials. And it's interesting. I was at a solar conference here in the Twin Cities about a month ago. And one of the things that really grabbed me was the recognition that many of the solar panels that are manufactured end up being broken in transit and then ultimately have to be recycled immediately before they're ever put into operation, which really kind of opened my eyes. I was like, this is a 25-year problem down the road, right? No. More than it is a contemporary one. And I'm wondering if you have any specific thoughts about solar panels and how places across the world are addressing the problem of recycling and end of use for solar panels.
Yeah, so two thoughts on that. One, it's expensive to recycle them still, and it requires a subsidy. By subsidy, I don't necessarily mean a state subsidy, a government subsidy. It could very well be a user subsidy. I may have solar panels on my house. I want them disposed of. I'm going to need to pay somebody to cover the cost of recycling them. Hopefully, as panels become more common and the waste stream becomes bigger, the economies of scale will come into play and the cost of recycling them go down. But I want to back up because neglecting for the moment the amount of panels that are broken in transit, there is a massive secondhand trade in solar panels. And it's based in places like South Asia, Central Asia, Afghanistan, Pakistan are major importers of used panels from the US. From Texas, whenever you see these solar panel farms get hit by storms, by a hailstorm, a lot of that stuff will be imported into places like Pakistan for what? To be repaired and reused. The other thing is, you get these manufacturer statements, well, these panels are only good for X period of time, or because of improvements in efficiencies, panels get taken off of roofs or out of fields after 5 years when they could have a 30-year, even longer lifespan. There is a secondary market. And from a policy perspective, I really hope that we don't have policymakers in the United States do what has been done with electronics to some extent, and sort of stigmatize the export to countries that really want access to these panels and provides them a low-cost means of getting access to renewable energy. It's a huge market. In fact, in Rochester, Minnesota, there's it's totally escaping my mind now, but there is a major brokerage and bulletin board for used solar panels around the world.
It's really interesting. One other question I thought was really interesting in the chat. What happens, when there's a disaster, especially like a hurricane or a wide-scale flood? And we see that more and more often, unfortunately. But especially when it comes to cars, right, and debris and other things that can actually take them out of work. Are there companies that actually go in and capture this, or does this just go into the waste stream generally and come out the same way?
Oh, no, this is a business. I mean, in Louisiana, New Orleans, whenever it gets hit, there are scrap recyclers in Louisiana who specialize in sort of this disaster reclamation. And the cars are great raw materials. I mean, once they've been flooded out, of course, they aren't useful. But what will happen is they'll pick them up, they'll pull out any remaining fluids, that are in the vehicles, and they'll shred them. And once they're shredded into parts, I mean, they're separated into the constituent metals using magnets and specific gravities, and the parts that can't be recycled are subsequently landfilled or maybe sent for incineration. But that stuff does get recycled, and it's a very, very well-defined business and there's market for that material.
Hold on. I think, one more question that I think is really interesting and worth discussing a bit is Mary's question in the chat about environmental justice issues that are potentially involved with co-locating like recycling operations and manufacturing. As she says, it sounds like a great idea, but doesn't it practically mean that recycling plants will be located near existing manufacturing plants? And then noting those manufacturing plants are oftentimes not sited equitably and put pollution burdens on BIPOC communities and poor communities. And I'm wondering if you have some thoughts about that co-location and what the environmental justice implication might be for that.
Right. Well, Mary, I'm glad you asked that question because I care about that question a lot too, and I'm glad we're gonna it's one of the topics we're gonna cover. Look, I think it's possible to greenfield certain types of facilities. Existing manufacturers and recyclers. It doesn't. You don't have to have a recycler come into a neighborhood that's already got high concentrations of BIPOC people who are maybe have already suffered because of manufacturing. There's the possibility of creating new facilities. In fact, we see a lot of new recycling facilities being built in the United States in the wake of the China restrictions. And I think a lot of them, I can't speak to all of them, but are being zoned equitably. They're being zoned in areas that are not going to impact communities that have been historically impacted by these kinds of facilities. And there's no reason that if you can guarantee a manufacturer a supply chain, a sustainable supply chain, you couldn't figure out a way. And again, I'm not a site planner and I'm not a zoner, but find a way to work with them to put these things into neighborhoods or into regions where there isn't as large an impact. I mean, I was just, like I said earlier, I was just in Phoenix and we were discussing this. One of the things that's interesting about a place like Phoenix or Texas, or even to a lesser extent Minnesota, is the amount of land that's going unclaimed, and it's very cheap to landfill, but at the same time it's also relatively cheap to put in large semiconductor facilities. And we know that Intel and TSMC are building enormous semiconductor manufacturing facilities there. Now, I don't know that you would set up a recycling facility next to a TSMC plant, but depending on the kinds of facilities you're talking about, there is the land available in places like that. And I think it's worth exploring where you have the opportunity, but I don't think you want to see recycling plants put into vulnerable neighborhoods.
Yeah, I mean, and I think from MCEA's perspective, and one of our biggest projects has been about the Northern Metal recycling operation in North Minneapolis, which is owned by EMR, which is a giant global conglomerate. I mean, it was badly sited, and it was creating lots of health problems for the neighborhood. And eventually, it left, and it found a site that was more appropriate, quite honestly. But I think that's one of those things that's interesting is historically, a lot of the locations were, in that case, it was redlining, right? That really concentrated metal recycling operations in North Minneapolis, right on the river, in part because of the transit opportunities of using the river to move materials up and down, but also the fact that, quite honestly, we redlined a certain business and certain people into places where they could not otherwise move. They couldn't buy land, they couldn't operate businesses, and they couldn't own homes. And that's part of the reason why we have that concentration here in Minneapolis and St. Paul.
Yeah. And I just should say, I mean, I have a lot of contact with folks in the recycling industry to this day. And I can tell you, by and large, they really don't want to be in urban areas. I mean, aside from the environmental justice issue, I mean, there's trucking issues, sending trucks into, neighborhoods like the north side of Minneapolis. It's not very efficient. They'd much rather be where they have the opportunity to expand, and that's just not going to be on expensive urban land.
Well, I think we've run out of time, and I really wanted to say, first of all, thank you so much for joining us. This has been a really important conversation, and I want to thank everyone who's been online. We've had as many as 250 people on in this conversation, which is, I think, a new record for these webinars. So thank you for attending and just for so generously sharing your time and expertise. I just want to say one thing, like this is this world of myth and spin that we operate in right now. I mean, part of the reason why we're doing this webinar series is to give people the facts and let people make better decisions. Recognizing that we don't necessarily get to make binary choices between what's good and what's bad all the time, but we have to make complicated choices about where we get the materials that we're going to be using in order to transition to clean energy, to transition to electric vehicles. And that's not a problem we're going to solve in one hour long conversation, but I think this is a good start.
Right.
And I just wanted to say a couple other things. MCEA's Minding the Climate Crisis series, including web posts and fact sheets and a video, recordings of this webinar and other webinars, are all available on MCEA's website. We ask you to explore those resources, ask tough questions. Ask us not just of us, but also of your legislative leaders and your elected leaders, and really dig into this question, because I think if we don't take on that responsibility for ourselves, we're going to get a lot of propaganda that'll tell us how to think about this problem.
Yeah.
And one last thing is just this next webinar is coming up 2 weeks from now, December 13th, noon to 1 p.m. And we'll take a much more Minnesota-focused approach here by talking to a local e-waste recycling company expert, a local academic who studies this stuff worldwide, and then also a state elected leader, Representative Athena Hollins. And thank you again for supporting this work. We genuinely can't do it without you. We welcome your support. There's a link in the donations in the chat, but otherwise we just want to spread the word. So tell someone else about this series and come back in a couple of weeks and we'll keep this conversation going. So thank you again, Adam. We really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Have a great afternoon. Try to stay safe out there on the roads and we'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.